Hello and welcome back to Book and Page. We are on chapters 11 and 12 of Percy Jackson. We're halfway through! Oh, this is going to be fun. As always, we'll start with a brief summary of what happened in these two chapters, then talk about things in a little more depth. So, chapter 11. The bus has been exploded and they're off in the woods. Percy and Annabeth try to get along, but they seem to be having some issues on this trek. They're soon distracted, though, by the smell of burgers. It turns out they are very hungry. They're gonna ask questions? No, they're not. There is a little gnome shop that attracts Percy and Annabeth, but Grover, for one, is just kind of like, I think we should go now. This place doesn't, no, it's not good. I think I smell monsters, and they're just like, we just smell burgers. The woman inside, who calls herself Auntie M, keeps her entire self covered for reasons that will become very apparent shortly. But the kids really don't think this through, since she's happy to feed them. The weird thing is that she knows their names. She seems to suspect they were already coming. It's a little bit weird. Grover, for one, wants to leave now. Ultimately, Annabeth also becomes suspicious and decides she's with Grover on this one. They should go. This notably happens after Auntie M mentions her two sisters. Percy, though, Percy's insistent that Auntie M was so nice to them they should help her out, and they're going to pose for a photo so that she can make more garden statues. Thankfully, right before this photo is taken, Percy sort of puts it together that this woman is Auntie M Medusa. Medusa is here. So he doesn't get turned to stone. Annabeth goes invisible. Grover throws off on the shooey adventure of flight and dive bombs Auntie M enough to give Percy a chance to get a mirrored glass ball from Annabeth and behead Medusa. Ultimately, he then ships this head to Mount Olympus with his regards, and Grover says that that's not going to end so well. They head off into the woods again, because obviously the gnome shop isn't super useful. They finally set up camp for the evening, and Annabeth falls asleep right away. Percy volunteers to take first watch, but Grover can't sleep either. It turns out he is very despairing of the fact that humans have littered the world and destroyed nature, and you can't see the stars here, and they've ruined a lot of really good things. And he points back to the point where a traveler once heard a voice cry out that the great god Pan was dead, and that humans believe this and ruin nature, while the satyrs don't believe Pan is dead. They believe he's sleeping somewhere, and that one satyr will ultimately find him. This is what they want their searching license for, and Percy's kind of like, well, why do you assume you're going to be the one to find him? Grover says, I have to think that way. And in this heart-to-heart moment, Percy admits that he's only really going on this quest to save his mother from the underworld. Grover understands that, but he's also pretty sure Percy wants some attention from his father. Percy's not sure how he feels about that, and when Grover offers to take first watch instead, Percy falls asleep. He ultimately has a terrible nightmare about something in the underworld wanting his help to be freed and rise. He feels like he's being pulled in towards the thing, and wakes up thanks to Annabeth waking him up in the morning. She's made breakfast, aka here's some chips, eat them. And it turns out Grover's found a fancy runaway poodle, who is then willing to be returned to its rich family so the kids can have their reward money. Their plan is to buy some train tickets with it. Yeah, that's a lot over 2 chapters. And there are some very interesting Greek parallels here, but there's also an interesting exploration of a Greek myth as well. The Medusa myth is kind of standard in a lot of ways. Like the whole mirrored thing, don't look at Medusa directly or be turned to stone, Medusa getting beheaded, the head still working after she's dead, and then the heroes using it themselves. And ultimately, that's really interesting in the question of Medusa as object. Which is just, that's gonna be a deep dive. Because it's a question of how you understand the original myth. And there's 3 ways to look at it. Rick Riordan has sort of he's taken the perspective that puts blame most on Medusa for her situation. Which is to say that she was having a love affair with Poseidon. And chose to do so in Athena's temple, which is when she gets changed into Medusa. But the careful thing you gotta keep in mind is that Poseidon is a god. So there's always a question of how consensual that relationship was. And Riordan here, like I said, really is taking on the idea that it is consensual. Like, Auntie M actually, fully owns up to this relationship and treats it as if she walked into it as a willing partner. And Athena was just being a complete and total asshole about this entire thing. If it's not consensual, then the change to Medusa can be taken in 2 ways. And this is sort of really interesting because it is, ultimately, it changes the perspective of Athena's actions more than anybody else. If it's not consensual, then the blame should fully be put on Poseidon. But what you know from Greek myths is this is never going to happen. Any of these relationships, like any of Zeus's extramarital relationships, Hera explicitly blames the woman and any children produced of that relationship. Which logically doesn't make sense because those women didn't have a choice. Like, Zeus shows up and likes you, well, you can't exactly say no. The whole adventure of Leda and the Swan, that's a bit questionable about, did the Swan... If the relationship is not consensual, then blame should understandably be put on the god that forced the relationship. This never happens. So Medusa being transformed into this snake-haired lady that turns people to stone when they look at her can be taken, like I said, 2 ways. You could either view this myth as Athena punishing the wrong person, which is to say Medusa didn't have a choice, Medusa faces the punishment. But there is an alternative perspective to this, which is Athena saving Medusa from continued assault. Which is to say, Athena changes Medusa to have this ugly disposition that turns people to stone, so that she will never be raped by a man or a god ever again. And those 2 perspectives lead to some very different places, thinking-wise, when it comes to Athena. Ultimately, though, they lead to the same place when it comes to the full myth. Which is to say that... I'm trying to remember what hero it is. I think it's Percy. I could be wrong. But basically, Hero comes in, beheads Medusa, and uses that head to his advantage. Because if you look at it fully, there are some versions of the legend, well, most versions of the legend, Medusa is then placed in some place that she can actually be avoided. And a lot of them then also have her sisters follow this. Here, Riordan saying the sisters chose to follow Medusa into the punishment. But they are then placed someplace where they're away from community, and then people are forbidden from entering there. Most notably, in certain legends, women are forbidden from entering, which is to say, that's the version where Athena has done this to prevent harm from Medusa and other women who are suffering under non-consensual relationships. Which is to say that Athena is protecting all the women on that one by forbidding the women to enter the area in which Medusa is, with the understanding that men are going to do it anyways. But Medusa then has a defense mechanism for that. It's just really hard to take that perspective without looking then at the consequences of the hero cutting off Medusa's head and using it. Because that subverts that entire sort of self-defense thing, where Medusa not only is an independent agent, because the first version, aka this was very consensual on both sides, that presents Medusa as an independent agent, and she was given protection that made her an independent agent. The middle one of this isn't consensual and Medusa gets punished anyways, she has no agency there. But like I said, the story ends, no matter what, with her having no agency. Which is the hero cuts off her head and she suddenly becomes a tool to be used by that hero. And ultimately, that sort of becomes the question in this moment with Percy. Because I really can't remember the original hero of the Medusa story. I moved too fast. I startled my cat. We're just gonna look up the original Medusa story. Yes, it is Perseus. Yeah. It is Perseus. It is Perseus. And so the original Perseus actually carries Medusa's head with him for quite a bit of the story after chopping it off. And he basically whips it out at every occasion. Like, at a wedding where he doesn't like the king who's trying to get married to his mother. Yeah. He just turns the king and a bunch of the king's wedding guests into stone. A bunch of centaurs get turned into stone. Like, Perseus just keeps using the head as sort of his deus ex machina type thing. Like, just, oh, enemies I'm not going to be able to defeat otherwise. Medusa's head. And Percy here gives it up right away. And even that has an interesting parallel, because the other place you actually see Medusa's head is on Athena's shield. Athena's shield, if you look at her statues, you look at images of her, she has this shield which has the head of Medusa with the many snakes, and it's meant to terrify the enemy. So Percy actually gives up the head to Athena. Athena puts it on her shield. So you can actually see Percy nailing the head of Medusa then as being that same movement as his namesake god, demigod hero character, which is the giving up of the head. But Percy doesn't do that because he doesn't have ulterior motives. He doesn't do that because he thinks, oh, this is a powerful artifact, we should give it to the gods so we don't misuse it. No, he is precisely sending it to the gods with the hope that one of them's going to open that package and get turned to stone. And Grover calls him out on this, where he's just like, they think you're impertinent, and he's like, I am impertinent. He fully owns up to the fact that he is still using the head of Medusa for his own reasons. Which, ultimately, well, that's still using a living being that used to have agency as a tool. And Riordan here tries to he kind of steps around this one by choosing the version of the myth in which Medusa is as guilty as Poseidon. And that's helped by the fact that Percy in this one is a child of Poseidon. And her being as aggressive towards him as she is aggressive towards a child of Athena. So, like, Riordan kind of lets this one slide by choosing that version of the myth and not looking at the connotations of the situation Medusa's been put in, how she's constantly been, like, brought back, used by the gods to fight their enemies, killed by a hero, and then the hero uses her head. Because this apparently is relatively common, because when Percy's like, why is her head still here? They say, oh, after she's killed it becomes a war trophy, like your Minotaur horn. So this tells me that, like, this has happened a few more times than just Perseus and Percy. So it's one of those things where it's just like, the connotations of that are not fully dipped into within the story. Unless you slow down and take a look at how the end of Medusa ultimately leads into the conversation about the god Pan. Because Pan's the satyr god, nature god. He's one of the kind of really uncomfortable ones, because he is this really powerful being that can be very chill, but can also, like, mess you up. He's a lot like Bacchus is. And again, always go back to that video about Bacchus, because you'll see, again, like, Dionysus is taking on some of Pan's aspects, as we lean away from Pan and lean into Dionysus. Which is to say that the gods are this idea that, at least the ancient Greek gods, of explaining why terrible things happen. Which is to say, if you're struck by lightning, well, that's not just a horrible accident that you didn't deserve and just happened because the world is unfeeling. It's just nature. It's a lot more comfortable for you to be able to say something along the lines of, that person was struck by lightning because he angered Zeus. Like, why do terrible tsunamis hit cities and kill hundreds of people? Well, obviously that city did something to anger Poseidon. There's always a nice excuse so that you can feel safe yourself. If I do the right things, I will not be punished by the gods. Which is very different from saying, I have no control over nature, and ultimately I can do all the right things as a person and still be crushed in a landslide because nature is unfeeling. So having Pan as this, again, god of both ends, right? God of of very vicious responses, but also chilled out nature. It's precisely to explain those two aspects. That nature can be very beautiful and you can enjoy it, but it can ultimately kill you. It's a lot easier to say, well, obviously, I did something wrong and angered Pan, than just volcanoes happen naturally, thunderstorms happen naturally, earthquakes and tsunamis happen naturally. And there's nothing we can do to prevent those. Again, it's giving you agency on that one. You have some sort of power in this relationship on the giving end, but you at least have some power. Which is what, again, 2 out of 3 versions of legend give to Medusa. She was just a little insignificant human being like the rest of us, right? So, trying to understand the gods in this way is to try and give us some sort of meager amount of control. So what happens when we kill a god? Like, really uncomfortable question here, but what happens when Pan is dead? Well, you can take a look at our natural course of Western ideas for that, which is to say that we could move on to other religions where we still have that style of explanation. It's not as give and take as the Greek gods. It's not like, oh, you get hit by lightning, you did something to anger Zeus. But some people still do have the idea of an omniscient being who sees everything and has a plan for it all, right? Or you go towards science, which is to say that you understand the natural phenomenons, you understand what causes all of these uncomfortable, unfeeling aspects of nature, and recognize that they're just as uncomfortable and unfeeling as the main result. And then maybe you start using your technology to try and counterbalance that, right? Oh, we're building an earthquake zone. Earthquake smart buildings. Right? And human tenacity allows us to do this wonderfully, even if we recognize that, there's nothing we can do to prevent a hurricane. It's not going to prevent people from rebuilding after that. But Riordan here, through Grover, is pointing out a really uncomfortable side of the death of Pan, which is humans becoming irreverent. It is Percy Jackson mailing Medusa's head to the gods because he is impertinent. It is humans saying, there's nothing out there that's going to punish me for this. And possibly, again, well, I'm going to get punished anyways. Why should I act different? Why should I change? Why should I make sure that I'm recycling and not littering and not filling the sky full of smog you can't see the stars? What's there to prevent me from doing all of that? Because Pan is dead. So that suddenly needs to make us think, because that is the use of Medusa's head. The world then being that inanimate object that has no agency, that we then use and abuse for our own reasons. The death of Pan is the death of Medusa. And Grover has to have the belief that Pan is going to come back. Just like we ourselves need to have the belief that we can come back from what we've done to nature. Because what Riordan is saying here is not that we're going to magically find this god and he's going to magically make everything better. It is we are going to recognize that our actions are hurting ourselves. that we are using something that is living and breathing in its own right and doesn't deserve to be used this way. And that we try and make up for our mistakes. But that's a hard thing for a story to say. Because they precisely point out in the book itself, this conversation of Percy and Grover, that you have to think yourself the one to achieve this end. You have to think yourself powerful enough, strong enough, stubborn enough to save the world. And I think a lot of us have trouble thinking like that. What's even worse is, especially here in like the Western community, that's not how it works. And I've seen this a lot recently with that new study about environmentalism and global warming that recently came out. And then a bunch of news agencies are like, here's how you can fix everything. Eat less meat. Don't use straws. And then all of these individuals pointing out the fact that it is businesses, like commercial, industrial businesses and corporations, that are causing most of the problems. So an insistence that this can be fixed on an individual level isn't going to work. But our Western ideals have constantly pushed this individualistic notion. And that's happening even here. That's Grover saying, I have to believe that I will be the one to do this. Well, why is there only ever one searcher? Why isn't this a community effort for something that's honestly really important? There's a reason why when they go on quests, 3 people go. It's because a lot of this is too much for one hero. The Greek legends lied about that too. But if we are to think critically about the death of Pan, I think we have to think critically about the death of Medusa. Is not the death of Medusa symptomatic of the death of Pan? And how we tend to look at other living things. The poodle at the end of this chapter is willing to make a sacrifice for these kids. If the poodle understands that sometimes you need to give a lot to get a lot, maybe we should be able to do that too. That's the uncomfortable thing, is when you start realizing that your books don't always offer solutions to all the problems. And again, are sometimes symptomatic of those problems. That just means you're reading critically, which is a good thing. It's just a question of what you can do after that point. For me, I'm going to keep reading, and I hope you do too. See you next time.